All right, so we're going to continue with Galatians. Miss May, y'all were here. I was starting Galatians. I'm still in Galatians. So yeah, we just roll along.
Slow teaching or slow learning.
Hey,
That's right.
that's all right. That's all right. But we're going to pick up reading. I kind of have been in a habit of doing this. We're going to pick up reading back in verse 7, and then we're going to read through verse 15. Just to give us context, we'll actually start talking about verse 12. Galatians chapter 5. I don't know if I said what chapter. Chapter 5. And so we remember that Paul has been sort of against what these rival teachers have been teaching, but more than that, he's been against the idea that the Galatian believers are being so misled and so misguided that they might actually be either confused about the gospel that they do believe, or they don't actually believe the gospel at all. And so Paul is concerned that the Galatian church is filled with people who are on the fast track to hell, thinking that they're on the highway to heaven, so to speak. That's free, y'all can have that. He's really, really concerned about that. So whenever we get to verse 7, that is the concern that he's voicing. He wants to know what's gone on. And he's been asking this since chapter 4. You treated me so well when I was here. You would have done anything for me. You'd have given me your eye if I had needed your eye. You'd have given me your arm if I had needed your arm. And now that I'm gone, you're going along with all of this, and you've made me out to be the enemy. How is it that you've done that? And so all of this is kind of an overflow of that idea. Remember, we talked about Paul and really anybody in ministry. There comes a point where you get burned out because you don't see any fruits of your own labor, right? You teach, you preach, you sing, you do whatever it is that you do, and nothing in the seats changes. Everybody just keeps on keeping on. And so Paul kind of is discouraged because he went there, he did that, he saw the Spirit moving in the Galatian church, and yet now that he's gone, it seems like all of that has just kind of stopped. So let's pick up with verse 7 and read. You were running well. Who prevented you from being persuaded regarding the truth? This persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole batch of dough. I myself am persuaded in the Lord you will not accept any other view, but whoever it is that is confusing you will pay the penalty. Now, brothers and sisters, if I still preach circumcision, why am I still persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. I wish those who are disturbing you might also let themselves be mutilated. For you were called to be free, brothers and sisters, only don't use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but serve one another through love. For the whole law is fulfilled in one statement, love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out, or you will be consumed by one another. I'll go ahead through verse 16. I say then, walk by the Spirit, and you will certainly not carry out the desire of the flesh. So Paul's getting ready to launch us into this discussion of fruits of the Spirit or works of the Spirit versus works of the flesh. He's setting all of this up in stark contrast to the behavior of the rival teachers that's there. And so we said, just kind of maybe to pick up with verse 11 and then move forward, Paul says, or he talks about his own persecution. He says, if I still preach circumcision, why am I still persecuted? Why are your rival teachers coming after me saying that I'm not preaching circumcision, if indeed that's part of the game, if indeed that's part of what I'm supposed to be telling you? If I was going from this church, say if I was going to the church in Jerusalem to preach and I'm preaching circumcision because I'm surrounded by Jews, but then I'm going to Galatia and not preaching circumcision because I'm surrounded by Gentiles, that would be inconsistent of me. But the reality is I'm not the one that's being inconsistent. And so that's kind of the trajectory that we're getting to. But Paul says he's been persecuted. He has the marks of persecution. We talked about earlier in Galatians, Paul says, Christ's crucifixion was made manifest among you. Quite literally, Paul has been persecuted. Paul appears to the Galatians, and he looks like someone who's been persecuted for something. And we've said pretty often, if you're going to be persecuted for something, actually persecuted for something, there's probably something to it. There's something to believe in. There's a reason for it. That doesn't always hold true, but certainly, I think I used this example last week. If you're just somebody who's willing to argue a wrong point just to stick with your point and to stick to your guns, that's kind of one thing. But I think for most of us, if we were told, okay, here's the thing that you're arguing, if you keep arguing that, you're going to die, we'd give it up pretty quick, unless there was something that really kept us rooted and really kept us attached to that. Paul says, I've been persecuted. I continue to be persecuted because I'm not preaching circumcision. But the other part of that we said is suffering is part of living out the gospel. We have conversations fairly often, or at least thought processes fairly often, about why good people have to go through bad things, why good people have to suffer and so forth. None of us is any better than Jesus. And Jesus suffered on a cross. That's not to say that every time something happens to you, that it's happening for some whatever kind of out there spiritual reason. But for Paul, the cross sets the pattern for the Christian life. You may or may not ever face persecution, but if persecution comes your way, you better be prepared for it. And you better know that what you believe is worth persecution, is worth death over. And he says that's the reason that the gospel is so offensive, because it is an exclusive kind of dogmatic position. You don't get to claim your Christianity when it's convenient and put it on the shelf when it's inconvenient, although most of us live our lives that way. We come to church on Sunday morning, we come to church on Wednesday night, put on our Christian hat, walk in and say the right thing, use the right vocabulary, so forth and so on, go out to our job and don't think about it again. Because it's easy. It's not that, don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing anybody any more than myself with that. It's easy to do. But he says, if what Jesus has done is true, then it's worth suffering for, because it has already overthrown the tyrants. It has launched the age to come. So whatever you suffer here, isn't it? It's what you're waiting for. It's that hope that you have in what's coming. And because of that, we can live in that community that's rooted in Jesus and nothing else. Jesus and what he did and the grace that he bestowed on us and the redemption that he got for us. So this is something that trips people up. But Paul says, or recognizes that his task is to announce the crucified Jesus as the Lord of the world. And he also recognizes, as we've already seen, the Spirit works in one way to convict sinners. And the hearers who hear that conviction exercise faith in the other way to say, help my unbelief, a lot of times. So it's this unexpected faith, this unexpected hope, this unexpected love that comes from the Spirit. And then on the other side, you have all the naysayers, all the people who are lobbing attacks against it from one direction and another. Not at the person who's trying to decide what they're believing, but at the people who are preaching to them, that are sharing the gospel with them. I think that's part of the reason why Christians should be prepared for persecution of any stripe, whether it be sort of mild, just somebody laughing at you, or if it's, actually facing death. Nobody likes people who are committed to what they believe. Particularly, and I'll say this, recognizing it's also happening in this time that Paul's talking about, but I would say that's also the culture that we live in now. They don't want you to be strong about anything. They want you to think something, but they want you to be malleable. Well, okay, this, but in this circumstance, maybe that. That's the... I'm getting on a soapbox for a minute, but it's kind of the issue with gender identity in the classroom now. This question of asking innocent minds, or telling innocent minds, you can choose. You can be whatever you want to be, but those innocent minds don't understand the full ramification of what they're choosing. And not that there's a choice to be had. But if you've got a little boy who says, I'm a little girl, and starts down that path, there's a point where you don't come back from that. And did they make that decision knowing, or did they make that decision because they felt pressured one way or another? Kind of the same thing is going on with this gospel that these people are preaching, this false gospel that these people are preaching in Galatia. They're not giving them the whole law. They're not saying in order to do this you have to keep the whole law. They're saying in order to do this you have to keep circumcision. And that's it. Well, no, that's not how this works. You either take the whole law and live according to the law and are judged by the law, or you take grace and are judged according to Jesus' righteousness, which to me seems like a no-brainer, but clearly these people are good at what they do. The other problem, and again, this is another slight soapbox, every generation has its way of trimming down the gospel and making it fit better into whatever the culture is. You make it look less scandalous, you make it look less countercultural, you make it look like what's going on out there, and you stick Jesus' name on it, and you call it a day, in various ways. I think I mentioned it last week. You can look at much of the 20th century, and it mattered what church you went to. It mattered what church you were involved in. It mattered what pew you sat in and how often you sat in it. It didn't matter that you were necessarily converted. It just mattered that you were there and you had that as a part of your identity. But at least church mattered. Church doesn't even matter at this point. That's not a central part of identity anymore. I mean, I don't get to walk into my classroom and point at somebody and say, aha, I bet you go to Venture. And aha, I bet you go to Temple. And aha, I bet you go to that tiny little fundamentalist church down the road, don't you? I don't get to do that because I can't even assume that they go anywhere. It's not just that I can't assume that they're Baptist, I can't even assume that they go anywhere. Because the odds are more likely that they don't than that they do. Again, not an attack on them, that's the culture. It's not an important part of who you are anymore. So Paul is saying all of this is actually incredibly important. How you can be identified is incredibly important, but don't mistake outward sign for an actual identity change. Because at the end of the day, that's what redemption is. Right? Jesus walks into our lives and transforms us and turns us into the best, well, he works on turning us into the best version of ourselves we can be. You know, we talked about this in discipleship. We see Jesus' miracles as supernatural things, when actually the supernatural stuff is the sin. God created it perfect. God made it perfect. God made us perfectly, but we entered into a sinful world. And so we have that sin nature because we're born into it. So it's whenever we think we get our heads around all of this, that we're at the risk of trimming something off and saying, that's not maybe the thing that I want to say in this culture. So maybe I'll say some other thing. But when we get to verse 12, and this is Paul being very sarcastic, very angry, not exactly nice Paul. Kind of the unkindest cut of all, if you will. He says, I wish those who are disturbing you might also let themselves be mutilated. Now, what he is talking about there is not just circumcision. If I can put it carefully, since we are in mixed company, he's talking about cutting it all off. The whole 9 yards. Be totally emasculated, totally, kind of like if you're going to do it part of the way, do it all the way. Not because, again, Paul is saying anything necessarily about circumcision. What he's talking about, though, is putting your faith in this earthly act, in this outward reality. Part of the reason that he makes this really kind of terrifying assertion is because that pagan culture that they lived in worshiped the goddess Cybele. And apparently part of the worship of Cybele was to work yourself up into this sort of manic trance-like state almost. And then it ends with the priests engaging in self-castration. So he's doing this sort of two-edged thing. Number one, the law's not going to get you anywhere. But number two, if you're going to be so committed to that, you're just looking like the pagan culture around you. You don't look like Jesus. You don't even look like Judaism. You just look like this pagan culture. They're just offering you new paganism. So you have that, and then the other side of it is the actual threat of being cut off. We see this in the Old Testament over and over again. If my people do not hear my voice, they will be cut off. All this kind of stuff about being cut off. Very Old Testament language, again, that's what he's dealing with. Bringing Judaism back into the picture. What are we going to do about it? Use Jewish language to talk about it. So Paul slams the door on any of the last possibilities that he might be able to approve of what it is that they're doing. He says they're out here teaching circumcision, they're out here teaching all of this stuff. You cannot have it both. You either have Jesus or you have the law. You either have man, essentially. You either have man or you have Jesus. That's it. All right, so if I can get this to cooperate. We move to verses 13 forward. And again, he's setting us up to the spirit, this idea of the spirit versus the flesh. What does life in the spirit look like versus life in the flesh? And one of the things that we've already said is what Paul is offering here is a justification. This is the way I'll say it, a justification of your faith. That faith is clearly expressed in the way that you live your life. That doesn't mean that if you are saved and then live a terrible life that you're any less saved. You're just going to get in with the smoke coming off of your skin, right? But this is Paul's pretty dense argument for practical unity and love within this single family. So remember, he's been talking about Abraham. He's been talking about the ways that Jesus fulfilled that prophecy, fulfilled that promise, and created this one family that's both Jewish and Gentile. And so now he says, okay, now that we've identified that, now that we know what righteousness looks like, and now that we know that you can't have any of this without Jesus, here's the way you should live it out. He wants them, and again, we miss this in the modern church. He wants them to celebrate and to cherish their unity as a single family of Jesus. Not as the church in Galatia, but as the church of Jesus Christ. Right? The fact, and it should amaze us, and I don't really know that it does, the fact that I could go all the way across the world, and if I find another Christian, they're part of my family. I already have something in common with them. I already have a bond and a tie to them because of that shared family that we're a part of because of our belief. So he wants them to celebrate this. He wants them to cherish this, and he thinks, again, we've talked about it, Paul would love for everybody to be on the same page about everything all the time when it comes to the Bible and it comes to the gospel. And that includes behavior. Christians just ought to act a certain way. So he gives us, in verses 13 to 15, sort of an introduction to this whole section. He picks up that theme of freedom again. And he indicates that there's this kind of paradox for those who are walking by the Spirit, those that are in the Messiah, because this freedom actually involves a new kind of slavery, but it's slavery to love. A mutual obligation to love. You are bound to love Jesus. Jesus has already shown he is bound to love you. All right.
That is one thing, the gift of love, I think God has gifted this church. I remember, we grew up in this church, and I remember when I came home from Germany,
Mm-hmm.
there was 2 people in this church that spoke to me the day that I came back, after being gone for
Right.
2 years. And this was my church family.
Right.
And I have seen lots of growth in the church, in our love for one another. Are we perfect? No. And there's a lot of areas that us, need to improve on. And of course, we need to even grow more in our love for one another. But that is the one thing that I see in this church, the willingness to love and pray for one another and to reach out into our community. Really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's, that really gets at the heart of it. You got to love the people in your doors and out of your doors. You got to hopefully love the people in your doors because they're part of the family. And you got to love the people out of the doors because you want them to be part of the family.
And Paul says we are to love above all.
Above all else. Yeah. So it's a...
That all fits the other parts of the scripture where it says, you know your faith by the works. Not that you work to get your faith, but
Right.
if you got works, you got faith, you're going to have works.
Right.
And then the scripture that says, you know a tree by the fruit it bears.
Right.
These all tie together that just says that that's what we have to do. If we're going to show the world Jesus Christ, we're going to be that light.
Right.
Otherwise, we're going to light under the bushel.
Right. Well, and the world, again, the modern church, I'm just on a tirade against institutional Christianity today, I guess, but we have confused love with compromise. We have decided that in the name of love, we will turn a blind eye to quite a bit. Jesus never turned a blind eye. Paul never turned a blind eye. But the people that they corrected knew that love is what motivated the correction. And so we have gotten on this thing where we go either to the side of being compromising and all right with too much, or we're horribly judgmental about 90% of what everybody does. It's somewhere in the middle. It's more along the lines of, okay, that's wrong. I recognize that's wrong. Jesus says, yes, I recognize that's wrong. I also understand that I've got sin in my life. So I'm no better than that person just because I can see what they're doing and maybe I don't see it in myself. But then Paul also says, and James as well, maybe it's John, one or the other, one of them at the end, if you see a brother sinning, go tell him and bring him back. Is it James? I thought it was James. Kevin knows James.
That in itself is love.
Right.
If you see someone in danger, let's just use physical danger,
Yeah.
and you put yourself out there to help them, that's love. That's what love is. That's stepping out to help someone else, even though it doesn't benefit you.
Right. All right.
And two, you don't have to be there, you have to do that.
Right. All right. Well,
See, one thing that we do that we don't realize a lot of times is that we think what so-and-so is doing is so wrong.
Mm-hmm.
No wrong than anything you do.
That's right.
And you
Right.
gotta write it anyway.
Right.
And a true believer wouldn't do that.
That's right. Well, we like to harp on, I'm just bouncing from soapboxes. Oh, well. But we like to harp on homosexuals, gay, whatever like that. Okay, fine. You want to, I don't want to say judge, but you want to call out the lifestyle. Okay, what is your life characterized by? Are you characterized by lying? Are you characterized by eating too much? Yeah. Are you characterized by anger? Those are all lifestyle decisions that we make. And at least the way I understand it, God doesn't say, okay, the gluttons will get into heaven ahead of the gays. Maybe I should rephrase, the redeemed gluttons are going to get into heaven ahead of the redeemed gays. Let's put it like that before I get in trouble. He doesn't say that. He almost says it the other way. The last will be first and the first will be last. Anyway, I'll get off of that. So, in verse 13, Paul says you were called to be free. Only don't use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but serve one another through love. So he repeats this point that he made at the beginning of chapter 5 in verse 1, where he says, "For freedom Christ set us free. Stand firm then, and don't submit again to a yoke of slavery." He repeats that same point. You're called for freedom. You have been called to faith in Jesus for freedom. It's like Israel being called out of Egypt. You know, I've said that Paul is kind of recycling this Exodus theme over and over again, and you have it again here.
We have heard of Brother Glenn and lots of other folks say, don't pray for patience. The trial is going to come. The same thing with this verse right here.
Right.
I have prayed many times, Lord, fill me and use me and help me bite my tongue. And Lord, have mercy. You can just expect that tongue is going to, it gets me every time. Every time.
Chris, would you like to comment?
He just says, Mom.
I got a blunt mama. I know.
My prayer about my tongue.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I got a.
Truth be told, we all have that problem.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And with mistake.
Truth be told. That's right.
My tongue has never been my problem, it's always been my delivery.
Yeah. Well.
Well,
That's true.
yeah.
That's true. And my delivery sucks.
All right. Now we're going to have public confession. Let's go. I wasn't done with 13.
I'm scared of it.
That's right. That's right.
I'm scared for you to say any more on that now.
Yeah. I went to this is not related to this, but I went to a Bible study the other day. I had a friend of mine who'd been after me to go, but it's always on Wednesday right before I go teach. So finally I gave in and I went and I sat there and they were doing Mark chapter 1 starting in verse 35. But it was where Jesus has been doing ministry in Capernaum. And he goes out by himself in the early morning to pray, and when the disciples come looking for him, they say, why are you out here? Everybody's looking for you. And Jesus says, okay, so let's go to the next place. And we started talking about it, and then the lady who was leading the study said, you know, this is one of those things. You can get so bogged down in doing the things that you're doing and saying yes to everybody else that you forget to say yes to God. And I just sort of like crouched hide me. I love it when the Bible does that to me. I hate it when the Bible does it to me. So, yeah. But if we're being, this is not at you, I promise.
You can use me for example anytime.
But if we're being convicted by the Word, then we're being receptive to the Word and we're letting the Word do its job. And the Spirit's doing its job. So we press on in the discomfort, I guess. But this whole deal about being made for freedom, or being called for freedom rather, and this recycling of the Exodus narrative anchors what Paul is going to say within this whole picture of the slave and the son that we got from chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. This kind of goes along with what he says in 1 Corinthians, which we like to hear said a lot. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. Right. You have freedom. Your sins are forgiven. That don't mean you should go out there and do it. Right?
Just I use illustration in a couple of my deals that the alcoholic can be forgiven, but he still may suffer cirrhosis of the liver.
That's right.
He still may suffer the physical consequences of sin. Even though Christ paid for the sin,
Right.
he didn't deliver us from the physical consequences. That's the reason we have a prayer board.
Right.
We ask for deliverance from the physical because we've done things we shouldn't do. So that's the thing on freedom from the sin. It's not freedom from the sin. It's consequences. It's freedom from the sin
Itself. Right. Right. That's good. So, it must be Kevin Scarborough. I heard singing. Paul says, don't use that freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. In the immediate context there, it seems to mean the opposite of love. Don't use the freedom that you have to behave like your old sinful self and to harm others. That's one part of it. The other part of it is this fleshly behavior that Paul is seeing among the Galatians is this infighting that's going on in the church, and that there's actual violence happening between these people. Certainly don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say this is all about physical violence. It's not. But that's the way that it's manifesting in the Galatian church. So part of that freedom that Paul so cherishes is freedom from the cliquey church communities. It's the best way I know how to put it. Those churches that are so enclosed, they're almost claustrophobic, like you walk in and you know, this is that clique and that's that clique and that's the other clique and there's nowhere for me to go and there's nothing for me to do and there's no way for me to serve and there's no way for me to worship because I don't know if I'm in or I'm out. Paul says this freedom is freedom from all of that. It's freedom to live in communities that are out here in the wide field, looking for opportunities to share that love, living in love together, and seeking out those that they can serve. So now we'll go to verse 14. Paul brings back Leviticus for us, but he's happy to do so instead. Traditionally in Galatians, when Paul quotes the Old Testament, it's not for a good reason. It's not for a happy thought. But in verse 14, we have a happy quotation of the Old Testament. He says, "For the whole law is fulfilled in one statement, love your neighbor as yourself." So again, we go back. If you're going to live according to the law, then you have to live according to the curses of the law as well as the blessings of the law. And Paul has already established people can't keep the law. So you're going to live under the curses of the law primarily. Because of that, the law can do nothing but enslave you. It can remind you that you're guilty, and it can enslave you to trying to do better, but you'll never get there. But now, that law is fulfilled in a totally new way through the love of your neighbor as yourself. That's, of course, Jesus. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your soul, heart, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus centralizes this notion in his own ministry. Now Paul brings it back and says, and this is the unifying characteristic of all Christians, that you love your neighbor as yourself.
Can I say this too?
Yeah.
You know, as we round this off here, we live a better Christian life if we understood that a person that maybe has just been saved, he don't know how to live. He don't know what to do. He don't know how to act.
Right.
And that's where we have failed society today. That we expect them to be like us. Or we expect a child to be a grown-up. You can't do that. Because they're not.
right.
And if you go at things with that attitude, guess what? You're gonna be defeated. Satan's gonna tear you up.
Oh, yeah.
We're all called to be peacemakers.
Mhm.
But to be a peacemaker, we have to understand that everybody's not at my level or your level. I'm not everybody at your level. Brother Reeves' level, Brother Glenn. And we got to love them anyway.
Right.
And help them to get to know what we know.
Right.
If we know it.
Yeah. No, that's true. Well, I think on that, I'm looking at my non-existent watch. But on that note, it is time. So, any final comments or anything anybody wants to add?
We missed that part of discipleship, that's what we're going to talk about. Christ said to go and make disciples, and that's to teach people how to live.
Right.
That's the whole.
And that can get you run off the wheel.
Oh, yeah.
Is that the secret to 40 years? No, I'm kidding. No, I'm picking. All right.